we will be doing a lucky draw and giving out prizes. With that, we will begin the first session. The session's theme is Global Efforts for Educational Recovery During and After COVID-19. The moderator is Professor Jae-Eun. She's a professor at Gachon University, and she's also a policy advisor to the Korean Ministry of Education and the National Institute for Lifelong Education and other institutions. I hand you the podium, Professor. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is session B, Global Efforts for Educational Recovery During and After COVID-19. As introduced, I am Jae-Eun. I'm a professor at Gachon University. In this session, we will look at the trends and movements of the international community regarding educational recovery, and we will take a look at the way forward for Korea and the international community. We have 3 presenters and 3 discussants, and then we will hold a Q&A session. The overseas presenters have sent videos, so we ask for your understanding that real-time Q&A may not be possible. The first presenter is Mr. Michael Ward, Senior Policy Analyst at OECD. He is also a former manager of PISA-D. He will be giving a presentation on ODA for education. Is the video ready?
Hello, everybody. My name is Michael Ward. I work for the OECD, and I'm very grateful to the organizers of this event for the opportunity to make this presentation on official development assistance to education as part of global efforts for education recovery during the COVID-19 pandemic. Let me start by defining official development assistance, or ODA as it's better known. ODA is defined by the OECD Development Assistance Committee, the DAC, since 1969 as government or government agency aid that is concessional. So that means that it's grants and soft loans. And this ODA is administered with the promotion of the economic development and welfare of developing countries as the main objective. ODA to education includes grants, scholarships, and soft loans. So what has been the impact of COVID-19 on ODA for education? Well, the short answer is we don't know, not yet. We don't know yet for sure. Data collection for ODA is about a year behind time. So the data collected in 2021 on ODA is on calendar year 2020. We won't have detailed data until the end of December 2021. But we already know that several efforts are being made by the international community to tackle the disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. And we already know overall ODA levels increased in 2020. In addition, the SDG 4 Global Education Cooperation Mechanism and other global programs such as the Global Partnership for Education, GP, are putting financing domestic resources as well as ODA at the top of the education policy agenda. So the good news is that ODA from members of the OECD's DAC rose to an all-time high of US dollars 161.2 billion in 2020, which is up 3.5% in real terms from 2019. And this is boosted by additional spending mobilized to help developing countries grappling with the COVID-19 crisis. Also, and I think very importantly, bilateral ODA to Africa and least developed countries rose by 4.1% and 1.8% respectively. So as I said, the details for 2020 ODA, we don't know yet. And we don't know yet the share of ODA to education. That will be confirmed, as I said, by the end of December. But when we look at the trends for ODA to education over the last 10 years, I think we can take some encouragement. When we look at these trends, we can see that ODA to education had nearly tripled in the last 17 years. Both bilateral ODA, which is delivered directly by donor countries to recipient countries, the largest bilaterals being the US and the UK over the last 10 years, and multilateral ODA, which is dispersed by the bilateral donors through the multilateral organizations such as the World Bank. We can see that in both cases, bilateral ODA and multilateral ODA, there has been increased. And as I say, to the extent it's almost tripled in the last 17 years. This steady growth to ODA to education reached a peak in 2019 with an amount of US dollars 15.9 billion ODA to education, which is an all-time high in the history of ODA to education. It's also important to note that ODA to education has been stable in terms of its distribution over these last 10 or so years. The shares of bilateral and multilateral ODA to education have remained constant since 2010 at around 75 to 25% respectively, bilateral, multilateral ODA. I think it's also important to note that ODA to education broken down by subsectors has also remained fairly constant over these last 10 years, with about a quarter of the total going to education policy, training and research, and just under a third going to basic education, and around 10% going to secondary education, with a little over 1/3 allocated to post-secondary education. So a fairly stable breakdown of ODA to education. Where we have seen a change in these trends is the share of aid to education in total ODA. So here we can see a steep decline from 2010, with something of a recovery in the last 3 years or so. But we end the decade with education share of ODA at 7.4%, less than it was at the beginning. Another important aspect to note is that more than half of ODA to education goes to middle-income countries, and this has been the trend for the past several years. Another area of aid to education where we have seen significant change in recent years is in private philanthropy for education in developing countries. As you can see here, over recent years, private philanthropic foundations have been significantly stepping up their finance for education, with the MasterCard Foundation and the Lego Foundation the largest philanthropic donors by really quite a long way. So it is clear that efforts are being made by the international community to tackle the disruptions in education caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. At the most recent, the 2021 Global Education meeting held on the 10th of November here in Paris, several heads of state and more than 40 ministers of education agreed the Paris Declaration, which included this commitment on aid. So repeating the long-standing commitment to reach the benchmark of ODA 0.7% of donor GNI for ODA, increasing the share of ODA to education as a percentage of total ODA. So as we've seen, it's currently 7.4%, and ensuring that the international aid to education is aligned with national education plans and consistent with aid effectiveness principles. So there's obviously still some way to go to meet these commitments. The ODA GNI is currently 0.35%, so only half of the commitment to 0.7. But it is a re-energizing, I think, we've seen this year of the international community to increase support for education. And just to highlight some of these international efforts, the World Bank, which is the biggest provider of external finance to education, in the fiscal year 2020, the World Bank provided about $5.2 billion in loans for educational programs, technical assistance, and other projects designed to improve learning. Another highlight is the Global Partnership for Education, GPE, another significant provider of support for education, GPE disbursed US dollars 818 million in grants in 2020. And through its replenishment campaign, which has reached its sort of climax in 2021, the GPE is seeking to raise 5 billion US dollars to implement its financing and funding framework from 2021 to 2025. 4 billion US dollars has been raised so far by GPE, and GPE says this will allow them to help up to 175 million children to learn and get 88 million more girls and boys into school by 2025. Despite, we must accept, I think, the possibility of a worst-case scenario in which, while overall ODA levels are maintained at the 2020 level, the share of this that goes to education reduces below the 2019 level of 7.4%, as aid to health, social welfare, and other sectors are given higher priority by donors. So, case scenario, and it is possible. But given the trends that we've seen in aid to education over these last 10 years, I think perhaps we can expect a better case scenario. This is one in which ODA to education is at least maintained at 2019 levels of 15.9 billion US dollars, and then continues upward, the trend of the last 17 years. But I would add that in this better case scenario, there should be more priority given to basic education in low-income countries to help them recover from the pandemic and to get on track for SDG 4 achievement by 2030. So 2 possible scenarios, and we will very soon know which scenario is our reality as far as 2020 is concerned. So thank you very much for your attention. And again, thank you to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to make this presentation. If you would like more information about ODA to education, please feel free to email me at the address you can see here, michael.ward@oecd.org. Thank you very much.
예, 감사합니다. 예, 마이클 워드님의 발표 아마 모두 다 잘 들으셨을 것 같아요. 글로벌 교육 ODA의 전반적인 동향과 함께 앞으로의 어떤 예측 시나리오를 설명해 주셨는데 정말로 이제 어떤 보건이나 사회복지에 대한 어떤 이제 지원이 늘으면서 교육에 대한 지원이 줄어든다면 이제 큰일 나겠죠. 그 시나리오는 성사되지 않기를 바랍니다. 예, 좋습니다. 이제 두 번째 저희가 이 발표를 들어야 듣는 이제 시간이 되겠는데요. 이번에 모시는 분은 에델 발렌젤라 동남아시아 교육장관기구의 사무총장이십니다. 이 총장님께서는 유네스코 평생학습원 자문위원이자 아세안 직업기술교육위원회 자문위원을 역임하고 계십니다. 발표해 주실 주제는 코로나19 팬데믹 상황에서 동남아시아 교육 ODA 신수요입니다. 굉장히 이제 흥미로운 발표가 될 것 같은데요. 예, 우리 온라인으로 예, 발표를 들어보도록 하겠습니다.
Excellencies, distinguished speakers, esteemed guests, high-level officials, and organizers, to all our participants, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all. It is my honor to present at this very important occasion. Today, I will discuss about Southeast Asian efforts in narrowing digital divide toward educational recovery after COVID-19. First, I would like to introduce you to SEAMEO. The Southeast Asian Ministers of Education Organization is an intergovernmental organization promoting regional cooperation in education, in science, and culture. We have 11 member countries, 9 associate member countries, and 6 affiliate members. During the pandemic, this had created an impact in our segments of the population, especially affecting the education sector, in which schools have been forced to close, numerous educational programs have resorted to virtual or blended mode. For educators and learners, these were difficult times. This has also magnified the pre-existing inequalities in access to meaningful learning opportunities. The pandemic evidences the gap in necessary devices for connectivity between the better off and the most underserved areas in Southeast Asia. According to the fact sheet by UNESCO Institute for Statistics shared on World Teachers' Day in 2020, over two-thirds of primary schools globally, or 73%, had access to electricity, which is critical to supporting online programs and classes. And in our region, this is 55%. Additionally, access to school's computer is not universal in the most middle and low-income regions, varying from 96% in Central Asia to 20% in Southeast Asia. Moreover, bigger schools are better equipped with financial, educational, and technological resources than smaller schools. Many schools are facing a severe shortage of basic resources. This leads to the differences in the availability, quality, and quantity of online learning resources for students in urban versus rural, big versus small schools, not to mention a large number of schools categorized as disadvantaged. So remote rural schools and small schools are at disadvantaged situation during the COVID-19 pandemic because oftentimes these are inaccessible and mostly located in underserved areas. Border schools are also disadvantaged because of their location, and some of them have other challenges such as conflict and fewer enrollment. These disadvantaged schools are at the lower end of disparities when it comes to ICT and digitalization. Thus, the pandemic heightened the digital divide that is contributing to disruption of teaching and learning. However, in Southeast Asia, our ministers of education have tried their best to face digital challenges in teaching and learning. SEAMEO member countries have utilized digital learning platforms to ensure learning continuity. Most countries, from Brunei Darussalam to Vietnam, use popular digital tools like Microsoft Tools, G Suites, Zoom meetings to conduct virtual classes, or online self-study, modular instruction, learning resources that are provided in the Ministries of Education website or Facebook pages of Ministries of Education. Educational programs were also provided via TV and radio channels. These are also common alternative learning approaches in Southeast Asian countries. In addition, our member countries have developed their own digital platforms, such as Indonesia with Teacher Shares and Teacher Learns platform, Lao PDR with Lao Learn, Malaysia with the Lima or Digital Learning Initiative Malaysia, Philippines with DepEd Commons, to name a few. These are all comprehensive learning platforms for teachers and students to facilitate remote classroom, offering free educational services and application in one platform accessible to all. I would like to inform to you the bigger challenge on learning lost in this region. During the pandemic, we have been hearing a lot of stories, some success stories and some are challenging stories. We have embarked on regional assessment, which we call as Southeast Asia Primary Learning Metrics, or CPLM. And the results of CPLM 2019 was shared in 2020 December, depicting the learning outcomes in Southeast Asia. Recently, we did the secondary analysis, the CPLM 2019 latest evidence in basic education, and we have reported low-performing readers in 6 Southeast Asian countries. The Australian Council for Educational Research served as our technical expert in CPLM 2019. We have 2 partner organizations from Korea, the Korean Educational Development Institute and the Korea Institute for Curriculum Evaluation, and that is CHAES. We also have worked with UNESCO Asia Pacific Regional Bureau for Education, which is NECMAP, and our co-chair for CPLM is UNICEF East Asia Pacific Regional Office. All experts have shared their experiences in addressing the problems of low-performing readers and recommended some actions to track reading policy changes and their impacts on learning outcomes. In Southeast Asia, we need to boost learning outcomes by improving system and practice changes so that we can reduce the number of low-performing readers over time. SEAMEO has been working with ASEAN Secretariat in Indonesia and the Korean Educational Cooperation Fund to implement the next round of CPLM, or what we call as CPLM 2021 to 2025. And we thank the Korean government for working with us in this regional initiative of improving learning in Southeast Asia. In fiscal year 2020 to 2021, SEAMEO Secretariat launched the COVID-19 Accessible and Responsive Educational Support Program. We envision that learners and teachers, especially those in disadvantaged areas, should be equipped and empowered to use technology and other alternative modalities during school disruptions. There is no one-size-fits-all in Southeast Asia due to the wide differences in context, operational realities, and infrastructure among 11 countries. Thus, we have developed in a positive lens COVID-19 programs to address disruptions, severely tested the resilience and adaptability of schools teachers and those teachers who have emerged stronger by pivoting the extended home-based learning, acquiring digital skills, and delivering effective remote learning. SEAMEO, together with its 26 centers and network, and the member countries, associate members and affiliates, are working now towards ensuring the digitalization of education, making it inclusive and meaningful to leave no one behind. Moreover, during the 51st SEAMEO Council Conference in June 2021 and the 5th Strategic Dialogue for Education Ministers, they have embraced the theme New Education Imperatives in a Post-COVID Era and called to action member countries, associate member countries, and affiliate members to champion education transformation in Southeast Asia through strategic collaboration and partnership. I thank you very much for your attention, and we hope that we can do joint collaborative activities together, capacity building, research, and the like. Wishing you a pleasant discussion. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Thanks to her presentation, we were able to see what kind of challenges SEAMEO members faced and what kind of efforts they made to overcome those challenges. And I think we were able to see how educational ODA works on the ground. I'm sure that SEAMEO and Korea and other donor countries will forge partnerships into the future to build further CPLM. And I hope that this will contribute to the development of CPLM further. Next, I would like to introduce our third speaker.
It will be the last presentation in session number 2, or the session B. And the presenter is Professor Park Jonghwi, Head of Innovation and Education of the United Nations University, and also she served as a former program specialist for ICT of UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning. She will deliver a presentation under the title of Education ODA in a Time of
Good
Crisis,
afternoon,
a suggestion
everyone.
from
Thank
United
you for
Nations
having
University.
Me at the International Education Forum 2021, and special thanks to the Korean National Commission for UNESCO. My name is Jonghwi Park, and I'm the head of the Innovation and Education Program at United Nations University Institute for the Advanced Study of Sustainability. I'm not an expert on ODA, but I would like to suggest some areas for education ODA from a UN agency's perspective, especially in a time of multiple crises that we are facing. When many countries were still struggling with the pandemic and its continuous uncertainty, there was a wake-up call from the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, or IPCC, through its sixth assessment report in August 2021. The main message in a very, very simplified term is that no matter what we do, and even if we stop CO2 emission completely today, the 1.5 Celsius warming is no longer avoidable until 2040. In fact, what we are currently witnessing globally is the impact at 1.1 Celsius degree warming. In Tuvalu, the sea level rise is affecting the people every day, and the entire nation is expected to be submerged by the end of the century, and there are at least 15 more island countries in the Pacific facing the same risk. You may have seen this famous media coverage at COP26 a few weeks ago by the Tuvalu Minister of Foreign Affairs making a speech pledging to the world in the knee-deep in the ocean. So each government of these island countries are really working hard to find a way to relocate the people in a safe and effective way. If the sea level rise is a slow onset of climate impact and triggers the government or planned relocation, floods like this requires a government an immediate disaster response for displaced people with shelters and makeshift schools. And the number of floods like this in for example, Indonesia and in many other countries, but Indonesia, for example, has increased from 100 floods a year between 1970 and 2000 to 1,500 floods a year in 2020. In fact, the number of displaced people due to the climate impact is skyrocketing. I just exemplify here three of the most disaster-prone countries with a large population in Asia, namely Bangladesh, Indonesia, and the Philippines. You can see from 2010 to 2015 to 2020, for just last 10 years, the number of displaced people due to the climate change are sixfold in Bangladesh in blue line and the Philippines in the yellow line the same. And a report says as many as 62 million people in South Asia only could be displaced by 2050, which is larger than the entire population of South Korea. So this is the main focus of my short talk today. How can education ODA help learning continuity and ensure right to education in a time of multiple and predicted crises like climate change, based on a current research that the UN University is currently undertaking. This regional study is a joint project between UNESCO and UN University, and is to identify policy and institutional barriers and also their readiness for ensuring climate displaced persons' right to education and also their right to their lifelong learning. Actually, we are in the middle of the research, but I would like to share some preliminary findings and subsequent suggestions for timely recovery and international aid. One of the preliminary findings is that there are indeed many different scenarios regarding climate impacts, and each scenario requires different responses and measures to ensure the right to education of the displaced people. For example, what would be the best way for international aid to provide a timely support to students who just lost their schools? Certainly, 1 month of processing the transaction might not be the best way, as you can see from this interview with the student who were frustrated because they couldn't go back to school for 2 months after the disaster. Second, how can we assist a government who is planning a massive relocation of their people? The physical accommodation like lands and housing is one thing, but protecting their native cultural identity that usually tied up with their land is certainly another. And what about children who left behind because a fisher father had to work in an urban area to earn their living because their river doesn't have fish anymore due to the climate change? What about people who had to cross the border and need to learn different languages and new skills to make their new life there due to the climate change? And what about people who decided to stay put or forced to stay and decided to cope with the risks because of the lack of resources or other reasons? All these scenarios need different strategies, and different international aids have a lot to do depending on the strength and the interest of the respective donor countries. So apart from these distinctive scenarios, I'm also pleased to share some other preliminary findings. First, data on displaced persons and whether they went back to their home or permanently moved out of affected area and why they decided to do so are extremely rare. For example, UNHCR says 80% of the refugees left their home not because of political conflict or violence, but because of acute food insecurity. If this is the case for cross-border refugees, you can imagine how hard it would be to trace the reasons why and how long these internally displaced persons due to the climate change were out of their home since the climate disaster. And it is really, really hard to construct effective measures if we don't know this data to begin with. Second, international and national responses alike tend to prioritize younger children and unintentionally leave out adolescents. This may cause serious issues because many research show that when secondary students are out of school for too long, they ended up getting married off or involved with crimes or not coming back to school because of many other reasons when the school reopened. This was actually evident in many research on the issues under the COVID-19 school closure by many organizations. Third, people tend to stay put in their home and leave the moving as a last resort when for the time that they really, really cannot stand the climate impact anymore. So there are needs for disaster risk reduction and resilience education program for those who decide to stay or those who are trapped. Fourth, remote learning can help ensure learning continuity of students. And as many research again in COVID-19 situation shows. But we have to remember, especially a high-tech country like Korea, when we try to assist countries with remote learning, we really have to be careful with what could work in a disaster situation where usually electricity is cut off or not stable for a long time. So some low-tech or no-tech even options should be considered. Finally, climate change cannot be mitigated without general public's active participation, awareness, and sustainable action. Therefore, climate change education is a key for mitigation and adaptation, and international aid can help integrate this into national curriculum for formal education, as well as general public awareness through non-formal education like community learning centers for developing and developed countries alike. When it comes to climate education, I would like to make an emphasis on making this climate education more action-oriented and that triggers behavioral changes. From this chart from UNESCO's report in 2019, you can see how much our climate change curriculum are still focused on rote learning type of knowledge-based learning all across primary, secondary, and tertiary education, and how little we do in terms of behavior change, which shows in gray in the chart. This gives us a message that we need to rethink our climate change curriculum to influence and change behaviors beyond the knowledge level of climate change. I would like to close my talk by listing some of the main donors in this area of climate displacement and justice. And many of them, as you can see, are from the Northern European countries. I hope that more donors like Korea heighten their interest in this area and help ensure the climate justice. Here are some references, and I thank you for your listening and attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Park Jong-hee. Your presentation was quite interesting. Korea has come up with a target of carbon neutrality by 2050. And also there is increasing attention to and interest in the climate change and the climate justice. And it has been a great opportunity for us to think about the meaning of climate justice. Thank you, Professor Park. This concludes the presentations for session B, and we have 3 discussants joining us here.
Allow me to first introduce our discussants before we hear their comments. To my right is Mr. Park Dong-seon, who is the lead shepherd of the Institute of APEC Collaborative Education. And he is also a professor at the Department of Employment Service Policy of the Korea University of Technology and Education. The next discussant is Professor Youngsup of the Korea University of Technology and Education. He is also a senior researcher for education and training policy at CREVET, and he also served as researcher for industrial human resource policies at KIET. Our last discussant is Ms. Kyungsuk, who is a chief of the Division of External Relations at the Korea Institute for Curriculum and Evaluation, and she has also conducted research on curriculum and global educational development, and she was a former researcher at OECD and other international organizations. So now let me first invite Park Dong-seon for his comments. He may speak about the presentations and also share his opinion about the broader theme of the forum, the implementation of SDG 4, as well as educational recovery.
For the past 5 years, I have served as lead shepherd of APEC Human Resources Development Working Group, dealing with education, training, and labor issues. In that position, I have witnessed 21 APEC member economies' various efforts to provide quality education to their students under the threat of COVID-19 pandemic. Because of the pandemic, students are suffering from interrupted learning, unequal access to digital learning portals, and other learning opportunities. This situation is worse in developing economies than in developed ones. Therefore, ODA and other assistance to developing countries is getting all the more important in our global efforts for educational recovery. In this connection, it was very timely and fortunate for us to hear enlightening presentation about ODA for education by Mr. Michael Ward, OECD Senior Policy Analyst. According to him, overall ODA level increased in 2020, but the share of aid to education in total ODA decreased below 2019 level of 7.4%. This is because donors give priority to health, social welfare, and other sectors. Fortunately, various efforts are being made by the international community to tackle the disruptions caused by the pandemic. For example, Paris Declaration issued by the 2021 Global Education Meeting calls for the increase of the volume, predictability, and effectiveness of international aid to education. Specifically, the Paris Declaration urges that donor countries, A, meet the benchmark of 0.7% of donor GNI for ODA to developing countries, and B, increase the share of ODA to education as a percentage of total ODA. According to Mr. Ward, the World Bank is the biggest provider of external finance to education, amounting to $5.2 billion in 2020. In addition, private philanthropic foundations such as MasterCard, Lego, and others have significantly increased their finance to education. I support Mr. Ward's suggestion, therefore, that more priority should be given to basic education in low-income countries to help them recover from the pandemic and get back on track for SDG 4 achievement by 2030. To ensure this achievement, I believe that a more effective monitoring and performance evaluation is required. Secondly, in her very illuminating presentation, Director of the SEAMEO, Madame Ethel Valenzuela, illustrates how different SEAMEO member countries utilize different digital platforms depending on their respective needs for ICT education caused by the pandemic. And I believe that the Southeast Asia Primary Learning Matrix, or CPLM project, assesses learning outcomes of grade 5 students to inform basic education policy and ensure all children achieve meaningful learning. The project will be a very helpful example for other countries. And if SEAMEO successfully implements the initiative of capacity building of teachers in close cooperation with UNICEF and the Korean Education Ministry's LEAD project, a mutually beneficial outcome will be achieved. LEAD stands for Learning Educators for Achieving E-Learning Development, and LEAD is a global teachers community engaged in the globalization of e-learning initiative. Thirdly, Dr. Park Jonghwi from the UN University raises the issue of ODA in a time of crisis caused by climate change. Dr. Park is warning that even if we stop CO2 emission completely today, the 1.5 degree Celsius warning is no longer avoidable until 2040. Because of this global warming, Tuvalu and other 50 more island countries in the Pacific will be submerged underwater by the end of the century. People need to be relocated for shelters and makeshift schools in a timely manner. Under these extreme circumstances, a remote learning can help ensure learning continuity for the students. And I agree with Dr. Park that climate change education is of key importance. To achieve an effective remote learning, I believe that teachers from different economies may conduct joint research and or develop new curricula. Thank you very much.
예, 감사합니다. 우리 박성선 원장님께서는 이 세 분의
Thank you very much, Director Park Jung-sun. You made a very thorough comments on the presentations made by the three presenters.
발표와 관련해서 이제 이런
With regard to the last presentation of the session, the director mentioned the remote learning or the online learning and the importance of such kind of educational methods. So if we have another chance, we'd like to invite him for further information sharing. Now I'd like to invite Professor Youngsup for our next discussant.
Okay, thank you very much. As introduced, my name is Youngsup Choi. First of all, I feel very honored to take a chance to discuss the topic of how the international community work together to overcome the negative impact of COVID-19 on education. In particular, since I've been mainly involved in vocational education and training policies, I would like to comment on the issues, very practical issues, related to vocational education and training. Also, it has already been widely mentioned, even through this conference, about the negative impact on overall education. Such negative impact seems to have been greater in vocational education, which requires learning not only on theory, but also actual hands-on skills. Korea seems to be no exception. In other words, also Korea's physical digital infrastructure itself is better than other countries. There was several difficulties in responding to the corona pandemic by using digital technology for vocational education. In fact, the Ministry of Education of Korea has already been actively considering the use of digital technology in education since more than 10 years ago. For example, the Smart Education Promotion Strategy announced in 2011 already emphasized the need for effective use of ICT in school education. Also, as for vocational education, the policy of activation of distance learning has been promoted. And on top of them, especially, the government has also tried to respond to corona pandemic by promoting the development and use of online courseware in vocational education. For instance, a special website was created last year by the government. The name of the website is Remote Class Data Sharing Community. Through this community, vocational high school teachers are creating their own online learning materials for vocational high school subjects and share them with other teachers. The reason of the background of this community was that vocational subjects are very diverse and much more difficult to transform into online courseware. So instead of relying on government alone, many field experts like school teachers have to be widely mobilized. Considering the fact that TVET, technological and vocational education training, is an essential part of the whole education system, it seems also very important for the international community to collect these diverse experiences, examine their effects, and share them with any countries interested in. Of course, the Korean experiences were not completely satisfactory. Many people point out that the opportunities to acquire practical skills have decreased due to the corona pandemic, and also others point out that safe and meaningful field training is not being conducted during the pandemic period. So clearly it is necessary to critically review the experiences of Korea as well. Anyway, by going through such a reflective evaluation and also examining how to apply or adapt these experiences to students and schools with limited access to electricity and restricted ICT infrastructure, we would be able to explore a new model of vocational education in the future beyond just an inevitable response to the corona pandemic. My comments end here. Thank you. Thank you very much.
네, 최영석 교수님 감사합니다. 이제 팬데믹으로 인해서 Thank you very much, Professor Chae. You talked about how COVID-19 has impacted all sectors of environment, of education, but as you mentioned earlier, it has particularly impacted the TVET sector hard because TVET is all about hands-on learning. And in Korea, in order to overcome these challenges, there were many efforts that have been made that were outlined by Professor Chae. Now I would like to invite our last discussant for her comments. The last discussant is Kyungsuk.
Thank you for inviting me to the discussion on the great presentation by Mike Wood and Ethel, Agnes, Valenzuela, and Jonghwi Park. And due to the time constraint, I try to keep my discussion short, concise, and succinct. The three presentations commonly seem to share the view that on one side of the COVID-19 pandemic as a crisis has had a devastating effect on education across the world. And on the other hand, there is a hope for discovery by taking the pandemic as an opportunity for change. Instead of highlighting the crisis aspect, I'd like to draw our attention to how the crisis can be opportunity for discovery and even growth with a focus on three aspects. First, after the outbreak of the pandemic, one of the key issues in education was digital connectivity in countries where infrastructure was poorly built. Here we may raise a question: what have the ODA to education done to improve infrastructure in such developing countries? And for digital economy, and fourth, industrial revolution age, and even the TVET for the future. And grant, scholarship, and soft loans have been mobilized to support. But when the pandemic outbroke, one main problem was diagnosed as digital disconnectivity due to poor infrastructure. The past ODA to education seemed to fail to meet such regional needs. While it is needed to predict the ODA to education at the post-COVID-19 and make efforts to increase it, but also it is very critical and significant to look for the way to improve effectiveness as quality control, not to repeat the same failure to meet the local needs. Secondly, large-scale assessment to measure learning outcome like CPLM in Southeast Asian countries is considered as a very useful tool to diagnose the current status of basic education and build up data-driven educational policy. While we can draw useful implications and insights from all the statistics of such large-scale test results and questionnaires responses by students and teachers and other stakeholders, we need to be careful in adopting the findings in policy and practice. The assessment is sample-based, so here we can raise a question: how representative the participating students are, and how about the data about the children outside the schools, such as refugees or climate change displaced pupils, etc., on which little data exists about them. Another question is how meaningful the statistics are to non-participating students and teachers. I like to suggest that the data from the large-scale assessment needs to be used to get a better and realistic picture on the context with the data from other sources in a complementary manner. Last, but related to the first and the second issues, it is important to sustainability of the intergovernmental and regionalized assessment aligned with the international standards to draw meaningful implications for policy and the practice as many countries do with PISA, TIMSS, or ICRS. I'd like to close my discussion by suggesting we need mid and long-term strategic plans to work in collaboration with regional and international parties or organizations for ODA to education. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kyungsuk. She focused her comments on student learning, and she talked about the effectiveness of ODA and designing ODA so that it is effective and to reflect the needs of the local communities. Thank you for your comments. With the help of our presenters and discussants, we have some time before the break. We have a question from one of our online participants, Hang Ji-nu, and Hang Ji-nu had a question for our second presenter who sent a video because she could not participate in real time. So we cannot offer you a response right now, but your question was that providing quality education is very important, and what kind of measures should take priority to ensure quality education. So it is a very broad question, but I would like to turn the question to Mr. Park Dong-sun, and I would like to ask him what kind of efforts are being made by APEC to enhance the quality of education overall.
Well, I think I already explained what we are doing at the APEC, so maybe let me refer to the Korean government efforts for new Southern policy and its focus on ASEAN and other developing countries, ODA. Korea, with its new Southern policy, attaches great importance to and priority to its relations with ASEAN and other developing countries. Accordingly, Korea has allocated 10% over ODA budget, that is about 400 billion Korean won for these countries in the fiscal year of 2022. This budget covers multiple areas, including education, health, and transportation. Because of the pandemic, remote learning using ICT is in great demand. Therefore, it is advisable that Korea increase projects to share with these countries its accumulated experiences and knowledge in remote education, as we are doing in our institute vis-à-vis APEC economies. Thank you.
예, 그 아세안 국가 또 이제 APEC 국가들과의 어떤 협력 방안에 대해서 이제 말씀을 해주셨습니다.
He commented on the cooperation between the Korean government and other APEC countries. We are running out of time, so we have to conclude this session. For this past hour, we have had 3 presentations and 3 discussants talk about the global efforts for educational recovery during and after COVID-19. I would like to thank all our participants, our presenters and discussants, and I hope that our discussions contribute to the educational recovery. Thank you.